Hello everyone. So today we're going to look into the biological causal factors involved with the presentation of generalized anxiety disorder. So when we're looking at this, we're going to begin with the genetics first. So the genetic factors points out that genes do play an important role and that they play a modest role with regards to generalized anxiety disorder. It's also found out that the heritability studies like twin studies have pointed out of genetics to have a 15 to 20% chances of genes to play a very important role. Another aspect that genetic studies have pointed out is that generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder may have some underlying common predispositions. So, these underlying common predispositions talk about similar genes that could be responsible for the manifestation of both GAD or a major depressive disorder. So, when we are looking at similar genes, so your question may be, so how do you think a person will develop a GAD or a major depressive disorder? So this purely depends upon the environmental factors, which are very specific and subjective to the individual. So basically it depends upon the non-shared environmental factors of each individual. So when the individual goes through a phase of triggers that could be anxiety provoking, the person may end up having a generalized anxiety disorder. Whereas if there are too many triggers associated with depression, the person may end up developing a major depressive disorder. So what disorder finally comes up depends upon the environmental risks. But however, they say that the genes responsible for GAD and major depressive disorder seem to be common. So one such gene is the serotonin transporter gene. So like we know, when there is a deficiency in the serotonin levels caused due to this particular serotonin transporter gene, we notice that the person may have anxiety or depression depending on the environmental factors. So now we're moving on to the next factor, which is neurotransmitter abnormalities. So here we're going to look at the different neurotransmitters and what is really abnormal about them. So first such thing is GABA. So it was noticed in the 1950s and it came about like an accident wherein the benzodiazepine category of drugs was introduced and it was given to people with anxiety disorders. So it was noticed that when this particular drug was given, the people with anxiety disorders had reduction in their symptoms of anxiety. So in 1970s, when it was further investigated, they found out that this reduction in symptoms of anxiety was due to the drug's effect on a particular neurotransmitter named GABA. Okay, so GABA, as we all know, is basically a neurotransmitter which has an inhibitory role. Inhibitory role is as in it reduces the levels of certain brain functions. So because it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter, it kind of inhibits the levels of the brain's functioning. So GABA was found to be at a very, very low level. That is, people with anxiety generally had a functional deficiency of GABA. So when GABA is really low, which means there is no neurotransmitter in the brain which can inhibit the levels of other neurotransmitters which could be a trigger. For example, norepinephrine is reflected to be high in individuals with anxiety disorders. And as we all know, norepinephrine is a hormone, is a neurotransmitter that kind of triggers the fight or flight response. So which means it always keeps the person on the go and, always primes them and keeps them hypervigilant. So when such a neurotransmitter is always at its peak and there is no GABA or a functional deficiency of GABA, which causes, which actually would inhibit such other neurotransmitters, when there is a deficiency in it, obviously the person is gonna remain in an anxiety state. So that was one discovery that they kind of found out. And they also found out that this particular drug kind of works by increasing GABA levels and in turn suppressing the stress hormone cortisol. We will come back to the suppression of cortisol in the next slide. Next, we're looking at serotonin. So when we are looking at serotonin, as explained in the previous slide, serotonin is reflected to be at lower levels in individuals with generalized anxiety disorder. So these are the three main important neurotransmitters implicated in generalized anxiety disorder. Next, we're going to look into neurohormonal abnormalities. So when we're looking at neurohormonal abnormalities, we need to be very clear with the HPA axis, that is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So what really is happening? So when a normal person, when they go through stress, what happens? So when we see something as stressful, or we perceive something as stressful, or a real stressful event has occurred, what happens is there is a release of CRH. So this release of CRH happens in the hypothalamus of the brain. So what is CRH? CRH is basically corticotropin releasing hormone. So when corticotropin releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus, it in turn triggers the release of ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is triggered by the pituitary. Okay, so hypothalamus in turn triggers the pituitary to release ACTH. So once ACTH is released, in turn it leads to the release of cortisol by the adrenal glands. So adrenal glands are located on top of the kidney. So the hormone final result, end product of this chain reaction, is the hormone cortisol. So when cortisol is kind of released into the bloodstream, after you deal with a stressful event, generally a negative feedback is sent to the hypothalamus to stop the release of CRH. So this in turn has to happen in order for you to be able to reduce the levels of anxiety. So hypothalamus needs to receive a negative feedback from the adrenal glands after you have dealt with the anxiety provoking situation. So generally, people with generalized anxiety disorder do not have such negative feedback happening. So which means the blood levels of cortisol kind of remains high, and which in turn causes the person to remain anxious. So this is a very, very important aspect of anxiety disorder, and this kind of maintains generalized anxiety disorder. So HPA axis proves to maintain anxiety disorders because it fails to send the negative feedback to the hypothalamus. Next, we're moving on to the neurobiological differences between anxiety and panic. So when we are looking at fear and panic, the brain areas involved in fear and panic is amygdala. So amygdala is like a chain reaction wherein the person immediately engages in a fearful, in a panic-like state, okay, wherein there is a rush of epinephrine, rush of physiological responses at its peak. So that's the brain area, and the neurotransmitter is norepinephrine and serotonin. So when we are looking at fear and panic, that's why we notice that the person is at their foot, at the edge of their foot, and their reactions are really at its peak and intense. But when we are looking at generalized anxiety disorder, on the other hand, the brain areas implicated in generalized anxiety disorder is the limbic system firstly. So the limbic system is a heart seat of emotions, so which is basically doesn't really cause you to be on the edge, but it's like it causes you to remain hypervigilant, okay, like a chronic state of tension, okay. So it makes you remain in a chronic state of tension or arousal, but not to the peak of you running away from the situation or jumping or doing things like that. It's a chronic arousal which remains in a person. So that's the limbic system's role. There's also the trigger of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. Okay, so bed nucleus of the stria terminalis basically is a tiny basal forebrain region, okay, which is basically an extension of the amygdala as well. So when we are looking at the bed nucleus, what it really does is it kind of triggers a person to remain hypervigilant, and the bed nucleus in itself is triggered by the neurotransmitter the hormone CRH, which is basically corticotropin releasing hormone. So what happens is, when CRH is at high levels in the body, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis remains triggered. So like I told you, CRH maintains anxiety, okay, because it doesn't receive a negative feedback. So when CRH seems to be at high levels in the brain, it kind of triggers the bed nucleus of stria terminalis, which keeps the person hyper vigilant. So that's another thing that is noticed in people with generalized anxiety disorder. Apart from that, it's also noticed that the people with generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder have smaller left hippocampal regions, of which research is still happening on trying to understand if this could be like an early sign. So that's another unique factor that they have found out. Neurotransmitters involved in generalized anxiety disorders are GABA, serotonin, and the hormone is CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. So these are a few differences between the fear, panic, and generalized anxiety disorder on the whole when we are looking at the neurobiology. So with this, we come to an end of this particular video. I hope you all have enjoyed understanding the biological causal factors for generalized anxiety disorder. I hope this video has been very useful for all of you. Thank you.